Chapter 32 of Stories of Old Greece and Rome by Emilie Kipp Baker. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 32 Oedipus. Laius and Jocasta, king and queen of Thebes, were very happy when the gods gave them a little son, and they sent to the oracle at Delphi to learn what auspicious omens attended the child's birth. To their horror they were informed that the boy would kill his father, marry his mother, and bring great misfortune upon his native city. Hoping to avert this dreadful calamity, Laius commanded a servant to take the child away and kill him; but the man, not wishing to commit so heartless a crime, hung the infant by its ankles to a tree, and left him there to perish of hunger or from the teeth of wild beasts. The king, believing that his command had been carried out and that the boy no longer lived, was happy in the conviction that the oracle would never be fulfilled. Meanwhile the helpless child was left hanging to the tree until a shepherd, chancing to pass by, heard his pitiful cries and went to his rescue. The kindly peasant then carried the infant to his master Polybus, king of Corinth, who befriended the little stranger and later adopted him as his son and heir, for he had no children of his own. He called the boy Oedipus, which means swollen foot. The young prince grew up in entire ignorance of his real parentage, and never suspected that he was not King Polybus's son, until one day at the royal banquet a guest, drunk with wine, was heartless enough to tell him that he was only an adopted child. At first Oedipus believed this statement to be just a malicious invention, but as he saw the glances that the other guests exchanged, he was filled with dread lest the words might be really true. So he went in haste to the woman he had always called his mother, and demanded the truth about his birth. The queen, fearing that Oedipus might kill himself if he knew that he had been deceived about his parentage, assured him that he was indeed her son. The youth believed her repeated assertions, and yet he was not wholly satisfied, so he went to consult the oracle at Delphi. From this he could learn nothing but the terrible prophecy that he would kill his father, marry his mother, and bring misfortune upon his native city. Determined not to be forced into committing any of these crimes, Oedipus fled from Corinth and became a wanderer. Once, while he was walking on the high road, bewailing the cruel fate that drove him away from the people he loved, he was met by a chariot in which sat an old man and his servant. This was Laius, king of Thebes, who was journeying thus far from his native city to consult the oracle at Delphi. The servant who drove the king's chariot commanded Oedipus to move out of the road, and flourished his whip to enforce his demand. The young prince was not accustomed to be thus ordered about, and refused to move so that the king's chariot might pass. The driver then struck Oedipus with his whip, at which the youth grew so enraged that he avenged the insult by killing the servant with his sword. The king hurled his spear at Oedipus and called loudly to his other servants, who were some distance behind, but before they could come to their master's rescue, Laius was stretched dead in the road. Thus the first part of the prophecy was fulfilled. When the attendants came hurrying to the king's assistance, they were horrified at finding both him and his charioteer dead, but although they searched everywhere, no trace of the murderer could be found. Oedipus, meanwhile, had escaped and was on his way to Thebes, whither the servants were now preparing to carry their dead master. Though strangers were usually noticed as they came through the city gates, Oedipus was scarcely observed during the many days that Thebes was in mourning for the dead king. When the funeral ceremonies were over, the young stranger heard one day a herald proclaiming in the streets that the throne of Thebes should belong to him who could kill the Sphinx and thus free the country from its baneful presence. The hand of the queen Jocasta was also promised as a further reward. When Oedipus asked one of the natives what this creature called the Sphinx might be, the old man to whom he spoke turned on him a look of surprise, and remarked that he must indeed be a stranger to Thebes if he did not know that the city was suffering from the presence of the Sphinx. This monster, he said, was half woman and half lion, with the claws and wings of a huge bird, and it had stationed itself just outside the city gates, where it crouched upon a rock so close to the high road that no traveler could pass it unseen, especially as it kept watch both night and day. To each passer-by the Sphinx propounded a riddle, and those who solved it could pass undisturbed, but those who failed were at once torn to pieces by the monster's claws. Thus far no one had been able to solve the riddle, and many travelers had already been destroyed. When Oedipus heard this story, he determined to seek the Sphinx and try his fate. Even if he himself were slain, he would not regret having given his life to the nation that had befriended him, especially since the oracle had prophesied for him such a series of crimes that he had no love for life. So, sword in hand, he went out of the city gates and walked boldly along the road to the rock where the crouching Sphinx lay in wait for its prey. As soon as it saw Oedipus, it stopped him and demanded that he should answer the riddle or else lose his life. "Tell me your riddle, then," cried the hero boldly, and the Sphinx replied, "What is it that in the morning goes on 4 feet, at noon on 2 feet, and in the evening upon 3?" For some minutes Oedipus did not answer, but he crept nearer to the Sphinx with his sword gripped firmly in his hand. The monster began to lick its cruel lips and stretch out one long claw towards its victim, when Oedipus answered, "It is man, who in childhood creeps on hands and knees, in manhood walks erect, and in old age moves with the help of a staff." The Sphinx, with a cry of rage and disappointment, spread its wings, preparing to fly away to some other place where it could find new victims, but Oedipus suddenly rushed upon it with his drawn sword and drove it over the edge of a precipice which was so steep that the monster was instantly killed by its fall. When Oedipus returned to the city and announced that he had slain the Sphinx, the people greeted him as their deliverer. They placed him in the royal chariot, proclaimed him their king, and carried him in triumph to the palace, where the queen Jocasta welcomed him. Shortly after this she married Oedipus, thus fulfilling the second part of the prophecy. In spite of the crimes that he had unknowingly committed, Oedipus reigned for many years in Thebes, and proved himself so wise and just a ruler that the people never regretted having chosen him for their king. 2 sons were born to him and Jocasta, and 2 beautiful daughters. The former were named Eteocles and Polynices, and the latter Ismene and Antigone. Oedipus himself was so content that he almost disbelieved the fatal prophecy at Delphi, but his happiness was destined to be short-lived, for the city was suddenly afflicted with a pestilence and famine which caused such distress throughout the land that the stricken people came flocking to Oedipus, praying him to deliver them from the scourge. The king sent at once to consult the oracle at Delphi, and his messengers returned with this answer from Apollo. The plague, he said, should cease when those who murdered Laius were discovered and paid the forfeit of their crime by death or banishment. Every effort was then made to discover who had slain the former king Laius, and it was not long before the crime of Oedipus was revealed. At the same time the old servant who had been commanded to kill the infant son of Laius and Jocasta was found, and made to confess his part of the tragedy. Oedipus was now convinced of his real parentage, and discovered to his horror that he had already been guilty of the 3 crimes that the oracle had foretold. In vain he had fled from Corinth to escape being near his supposed parents, and in vain too he had sought refuge in another city, believing that the one he had left was his birthplace. When the queen Jocasta realized the full horror of her relationship to Oedipus, she committed suicide, and the king, rushing into her apartment at the sound of her cries, saw her lifeless body on the ground. In despair at this sight, Oedipus, the unwilling cause of the tragedy, was seized with a sudden madness and put out both his own eyes, declaring that the sunlight would be forever hateful to him. Blind, penniless, and on foot, he left the palace and the city on which he had brought such disaster, and wandered over the land, accompanied by his devoted daughter Antigone, who clung to the fallen king the more lovingly because of his misery and disgrace. After many days of wandering in the rain and cold, begging their scanty food, and resting in any wayside spot that offered them shelter, Oedipus and his daughter came to Colonus, a village near Athens. Here was a deep and almost impenetrable forest, which the Greeks believed to be sacred to the Furies. In this gruesome spot Oedipus declared that he would stay the rest of his days, and bidding his daughter farewell, he entered the dark forest alone. Antigone, weeping and clinging to her father's arm, besought him to let her stay beside him, for what could he, old and blind and helpless, do in that fearful spot but perish? Oedipus gently released her clinging hands, and refused to allow her to go any farther with him, assuring her that to him who lived ever in the eternal night of blindness there were no terrors in the darkness of the forest. So Antigone sadly returned to Athens, and the blind king groped his way among the thick underbrush and fallen trees. At nightfall a terrible storm came up, and its forerunner, the wind, shook the forest as if it were some child's toy; but still the old king felt his way among the trees, and the lightning, as it flashed into the dark places of the forest, illumined a figure bent and shaking, but grim, determined, and unafraid. The next day, when the storm was over, a party of men sent by Theseus, king of Athens, went in search of Oedipus, but no trace of him was ever found, and the ancients believed that the Furies dragged him down into Hades, where he received a fitting punishment for his crimes. The plague having been removed from Thebes by the death of Oedipus, according to the words of Apollo, the city returned to its former prosperity, and then began a fierce dispute between the king's two sons as to which of them should succeed to the throne. A compromise was finally agreed upon whereby the eldest son, Eteocles, was to reign for 1 year, and at the end of the year the second son, Polynices, was to accede to the throne and rule for the same length of time. The dispute being settled amicably, Polynices set out for adventures in foreign lands during his brother's reign, and at the end of the year he returned to claim his right to wield the scepter of power. Eteocles refused, however, to relinquish the throne, and with the help of the soldiers drove Polynices out of the city. Furious at this treachery, but unable to retaliate single-handed, Polynices fled to the court of Adrastus, king of Argos, where he was hospitably received. On relating the story of his wrongs, he so won the sympathy of the king that the kindly monarch promised to help him regain his kingdom. Later on the banished prince married Adrastus's daughter, and the king equipped a large army to go with Polynices to Thebes. At the head of the troops he placed 7 valiant chiefs who were determined to win the city from the usurper or perish in the attempt. These leaders gave this celebrated expedition the name of the 7 against Thebes. If courage and boldness were enough to overthrow a city, the besiegers would have won an easy victory, but their bravery was of no avail against a place so well fortified and defended as Thebes. After a 7 years' siege, the leaders of the attacking forces grew weary of espousing a hopeless cause, and decided that the quarrel between the two brothers must be settled by a duel. Accordingly Polynices and Eteocles met face to face, and fought so fiercely that both of them were killed. The only one left in the city who could rightfully assume the reins of authority was Creon, the father of Jocasta, who was now proclaimed king of Thebes. By Creon's order the body of Eteocles was given all the honors of a royal burial, but the corpse of Polynices was left on the battlefield a prey to dogs and vultures. Then the king issued a proclamation that if anyone dared to touch the body of the dead prince he would be buried alive. The friends of Polynices did not venture to defy this edict, but his sister Antigone, horrified at the thought of leaving her brother's body to suffer such disgrace, determined to ignore the king's barbarous decree. As she was unable to procure any assistance, she dug a grave with her own hands and buried Polynices, performing such funeral rites for the repose of the dead as she could accomplish alone. While she was engaged in this act of devotion, she was seen by the soldiers of Creon, who dragged her at once into the presence of the king. Although Antigone was one of his own family, and was also the promised wife of his son Haemon, the relentless monarch condemned her to death. Haemon pleaded with his father to spare the life of his betrothed, since her deed, though in defiance of the king's order, had been one of praiseworthy devotion. But Creon would not revoke his decision, and condemned Antigone to the most horrible of deaths, that of being buried alive. While this inhuman sentence was being carried out, Haemon leapt into the grave where Antigone was kneeling, and declared that he would die by her side. As the terrible process of walling in the lovers was slowly completed, Antigone died in Haemon's arms, and when he felt her lifeless body lying limp in his embrace, he ended his own life with his dagger. End of chapter 32.